Welcome to Rethinking Youth Ministry, where each week we hope to raise the bar for youth ministry by asking questions, interviewing thinkers, and having some real, honest conversations about what it looks like to lead the next generation. I'm CJ, and today, as always, I'm excited to be sitting here with Chef.
Hey, everybody.
Crystal.
Hey there.
And Stuart.
My homies.
Oh, good grief.
Okay. He does have his hood up, so...
Chef had his up earlier.
I did.
Oh, that's true.
But that was because you were here.
You put your hood
Chef walked in looking like Assassin's Creed.
Okay.
It's our thinking caps, dude. It's our thinking caps.
Thinking
right.
caps.
That's
This
right.
is going to be a thinking kind of episode, and I'm excited to get into it. Because today on Rethinking Youth Ministry, we are talking about the question, how do you navigate the tension between science and faith in youth ministry? Now, before we jump in, I do want to explain what our hope is for this conversation, and really what this conversation is not. So this is not a conversation where we hope to share all of our views about how specifically God created the world, or how long it took, or our particular views about events like the flood. What this is a conversation about how we talk about and navigate these potential tension points with our students. So in other words, this isn't a conversation about us and what we think, or even what you, the youth leader, thinks. This is about what our students are thinking and how we can best meet them where they're at when it comes to issues and questions about science and faith.
I love it.
So with that, let's jump into it. My first question is, why are we talking about the tension between science and faith? Why is this a growing issue with students and the church these days? Because I don't feel like there was this much tension around it growing up. And by say growing up, I mean, Stuart, when you grew up, or when I grew up.
Time ago, different times.
Yes.
Or when Crystal was growing up.
Hey,
Which
is it
was much
possible?
more recent.
Right? Which is much more recent. Yes.
Is it
When
possible-
wheels were square.
Is it possible that it's not growing? I mean, I feel like it's kind of receding. Like it hit a maximum, and then it's still a real thing. It's still a real tension, especially depending if you're in a super conservative church, probably.
Right.
But I feel like it really kind of hit maybe when I was a kid, and maybe it's just the story of my life, but it's still a big deal, but it doesn't feel quite as intense as it used to. Or do you think it's growing?
I think we hear about it less because it's so common.
Well, that might be a good.
But I also think, particularly for students, sometimes the tension is more internal than external because
that's a good
they
point.
have had access to information that we never had access to. What I had access to in the 10th grade was a biology teacher named Orpheus Deaver.
What was his name again?
Orpheus Deaver.
Bless you.
He was a
Rest in
biology
peace.
teacher?
Wow.
Okay.
But I didn't have access to 100,000 YouTube videos with someone explaining in really succinct and understandable and logical ways how evolution worked. And that's what my students have. And
So they might not even be asking, or they might not even see, or they just feel like they have an answer and that the church isn't a place to get an answer like that.
right, they may feel like they have an answer and the church disagrees, and so we just don't bring it up so we can all be friends.
And some of this may be demographical.
All
Some
day.
of this may be age appropriate.
Yeah.
For sure.
Some of this could depend on the type of church that you attend.
Yeah.
All of those things come into play. And if you're listening and thinking, yes, this happens all the time in my small group, well, there could be as many people going, this never happens in
Yeah.
my small group,
Yeah.
depending on those things.
I mean, we felt that tension between the demographic differences in my own small group.
Right.
Where this topic came up, and some students had legitimate questions because of
And you're talking about your small group you're leading right now.
the small
So
group
this
that
is
I'm
recent.
leading right
Okay,
now.
great.
Maybe just 3 months ago, the topic of science and faith comes up, and there are some students with legitimate questions that bother them. There are students who are fully invested in all of science's explanations, and it's never occurred to them that there's a tension. And then there are some students who are fully invested in all of the traditional Christian explanations of all events and can't understand why their friends even have questions about this. And they all live in the same town, they all go to the same school, but their families are different.
And there's also a group that's going, what's the big
cares?
deal?
Yeah,
Yeah, who
who
cares?
cares?
And I think that a lot of times that's some of the tension that I think youth workers feel, because they're real science-minded kids are asking really tough questions, and I've never really wrestled with it, so I don't know how to answer your question.
So what is the tension for youth leaders when it comes to navigating this?
Well, I think one of them is we don't know the answers. and we feel the need to give a succinct answer to something, and even when you do give a succinct answer, it feels like I'm guessing. And when you're giving succinct answers and you're guessing, you should feel uncomfortable. Or you just feel like you're not doing a good job when you say I don't know. Or you're going to get in trouble if you say what you really believe, because the church's websites is something very succinct, and anyway, that's my guess. Any other guesses?
Well, tension itself is it's a game changer, because anytime we feel tension, you either want to shrink from it or you want to stay under it. You can't grow strong unless you stay under tension. And I think some of what's happened is that if we look at church youth ministry at a very basic level, teenagers are coming to the church that bases everything around one ideology, and they have questions that seem to contradict that ideology. And they have questions where they didn't have questions years ago because you had to, I think, the digital decentralization of information means that you can say something in your small group that a kid in 5 minutes can disprove via Google.
Right.
So consequently, that tension feels even more smothering and scary and that kind of thing.
And to your point about tension, I think part of it comes from this binary culture that we're living in, where every issue seems to have two sides who just hate each other. And for a long time, at least in the context where I grew up, this may not be true for everybody, when it came to science, there was this tendency from church people to make fun of or to act like people who believed those things were dumb. And then on the flip side, in the culture of maybe intellectuals, but especially in atheist culture, there's a tendency to act like people of faith are dumb. And so it's created this binary where students have to decide which side they're going to sit on. And my girls are absolutely experiencing this right now, that students choose sides and they call the people on the other side stupid. And so you have to decide what kind of stupid you want to be, basically. Right. And that's really tough.
Right. And that point itself may be a good place for us to recognize that God has put enough in the world to make faith a very reasonable thing, but he's left enough out of the world to mean that if all you do is trust in reason alone, you're in trouble. So faith and reason have to constantly work in unison with each other. It can't be an either or.
Yeah.
When I was a teacher, I had a student in my classroom who actually went on field trips with me, and we knew each other pretty well. She knew me well enough to know that I was a person of faith outside the classroom. And so her dad began to send me materials from a website called Reason Saves. And I was like, wait, that's a thing?
Right.
That's a thing. And his entire stance was, if it's not reason, then you are unreasonable.
Right.
Which I thought was really interesting.
That is very interesting. But the tension, to me, is a great thing. If you're a youth leader listening to this right now, it simply means you have the opportunity to grow. And the way that I try to think about science and faith and my own growth process is similar to, when we were children and someone asked us where babies came from, that answer hopefully differs from where I think babies come from now.
Gooses bring babies.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, very thin, tall gooses.
Can we say geese?
No, that was a quote from my wife when she was a baby. She told her mom, "Gooses bring babies," and her mom said, "That's exactly
right." But
I was told
giving
I was
that
found
same
under a
answer
cabbage leaf.
today at her age, she would look really, really silly. And I think that's part of the tension for the youth leader is this is an incredible opportunity for us to grow. And what I'm learning about myself as it relates to science is that I don't want to be stuck. But it doesn't mean I have to know all the answers. What it does mean is I better know some of the questions.
That's great.
So I'm a little slow here, Stuart. So I'm going to go back to what you were saying just a second ago about the reason and the faith thing. Because as I'm processing this, and maybe our listeners are processing too, maybe they're ahead with you. Some might be tracking with me, and they're like, wait, that was a big idea. And as I'm sitting here processing that, I'm also thinking in a way, that is the tension, the reason and faith thing, because I think students growing up these days are thought everything has to have logic and reason, or
It
you
should
don't
be
believe.
reasonable. Yes.
Or there is a section of students who are hardwired. That
Right.
way, right?
Totally.
A group of your students just need to think that way.
And so they're on one end of that, spectrum, if you will. And then on the other hand, you have youth pastors and leaders who are so faith grounded that to say that you've got to have logic or reason to all of this is to not have faith.
Right.
And so what we're saying here is there's a tension, there's a disconnect between these two, and what does it look like to get on the same page?
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of I'm a sciencey guy. I have a degree in physics.
Were you Chef the science guy?
No.
You are now.
You are now.
Yeah.
Chef the science cooker.
C is for credit hour when it comes to having a degree in physics. But that's just how my brain works. And that is not how my youth workers' brain worked. So when I went and I was just trying to clarify, hey, through reason, tell me how the creation story kind of gels with what I'm learning in science about the dinosaurs, the age of the earth, all those sorts of things. Just looking for an answer. And the answer I got was, you've got to have more faith in that. I went looking for a reasonable answer, and I got oh no, you don't have enough faith. And for me, that wasn't helpful, mostly because I was confused.
Right.
Right. And I was like, okay, but it didn't make my logical question go away.
Correct.
It made me feel guilty about my lack of faith. Or it made me wonder if God was big enough to answer that question.
Right. What Chef's pointing to is why navigating the tension well is really important.
Yeah.
Because that's Chef, I'm assuming, as a physics teacher.
Well, I mean, I was 13, 14 years old.
14 years old,
right?
and however many years ago.
Yeah.
And now the 13 or 14-year-old has access to more information.
Right.
Well, that's exactly right. So I could just go Google that question. And there are lots of people out there who are happy to tell me the answer to that, true or not,
Right.
that are much more willing to answer the question. So
And
where do we want them to go?
Right.
When science seems unafraid to answer our questions, and the church makes it seem like God's mad when we ask questions, it paints a picture of a weak God.
Oh, my word.
But I mean, what an opportunity to paint a picture of an amazing God who created you with a logical mind and who is, unveiling himself through nature and all of these great questions. And God is a question, right? God's way bigger than we can handle. So the fact that you can't answer the question is not evidence that there's not a God. It's evidence that God's exactly who he said he is in a lot of opportunities. So it's really a positioning thing at that point. I mean, we're getting practical at this point, but how you're responding to a kid, really, the look in your eyes probably has more to say than your actual logical answer.
Right.
Fear and panic versus wow, amazement. That's probably yeah.
That's good.
So what questions are students asking these days that they weren't asking 20 years ago about faith, God, the Bible? So I think it's important to acknowledge some of those things.
So I don't know if this is true everywhere in the country, but 10th grade world history, where we live, is where they begin to examine that most ancient cultures had flood stories, and that calls into question the authenticity of our flood story. And why? Well, if our story is the story, why do other cultures have a different story, and where were they during this story?
Yeah.
And so that's come up a few times in my small group about what about the flood stories.
I think all the questions are usually on the outer edge of what we're learning about science, right? So as our knowledge grows, and let's be clear, we don't know more than we know still.
Right.
And
That's great.
We're picking up, so the big questions are always on the outer edges of that. So, I think, and this has always been true, at one point a scientific principle was the earth was flat.
Correct.
And somebody started pushing. I mean, the Greeks.
Kyrie Irving just recently.
He just figured it out. Yeah, those sorts of things. I mean, Aquinas was writing about these things in the 1200s, 200 years before Copernicus is talking about orbits and all these sorts of things. So, I mean, and the questions are always on that outer edge. So we're going to see a lot of questions for kids who are really paying attention. Obviously the creation story, evolution, there's questions in that range. If you're really paying attention, you start asking about stem cells and morality in science,
Right.
and things like that.
At the recording of this podcast, there's an article that's come out this week that states that scientists will be able to recreate physical dinosaurs within the next 5 years.
Wow.
So it's that kind of thing. I think.
Sell me a ticket
I
to
hope
that.
they keep them in a park.
Yeah.
Spared no expense.
Yeah, this is
Spared no expense.
Have they learned nothing?
Apparently not. Where's Jeff Goldblum when you need him?
Michael Crichton, save us. Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to kind of bring that up because when you start to verbalize some of the questions and ideas and thoughts, well, one, it makes them a lot more real than it's just a theoretical, like, how do we navigate this? But two, I think it raises the tension that, is this a theological issue with our students? Are we trying to figure out, okay, with all of these questions, are we providing theological answers? Are we providing different kind of answers? What does it look like to navigate this? Because I think most youth pastors would, maybe not most, I don't know. But like if a student questions the flood, I'm going to give them a theological flood response.
Narrative, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's always the most helpful response because there's always going to be another question behind it. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, do we provide theological answers or is there a different alternative?
Well,
way?
I think practically one thing you can do very easily is just add, especially in these, when you're out on these edges, one preface you can just add to all your answers is, well, many Christians believe, or many, and so you're clarifying like, hey, there are within the Christians who believe that Jesus died and rose again, a few opinions of that. And in my experience, many of the like sciencey kids, that's enough for them to go, oh, so that's kind of in this area of faith, that Christians are arguing about what that really means. But they agree on the most important, the kind of the foundational aspects of, and I know there's a group out there that's going, that's dangerous.
Right.
Truth is truth, right? But I think, there are tons of areas of Scripture in which, at my seminary, professors who signed agreements of faith would disagree about what things mean. And to say, this kind of falls into one of those areas into which I think the only thing we know for sure, we all have our thoughts, but the only thing we know for sure is when we get to heaven and clarify this, we're all going to be surprised.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Right.
And there are just a lot of those areas in Scripture.
Yeah.
Well, and I think we do, it's a service to students when we identify different patterns of thought and ways that different Christians and non-Christians believe. I'm trying out something this year with some of the questions that come up where I just say, hey, here are 2 or 3 different views on that.
Yeah.
I usually try to end the conversation with, here's what I know for sure. And it's not my personal, theological point of view, but it is, there is a God, he is infinite, he is good. Just the very basics of that. We don't know all the answers. I know that for sure. Then sometimes they'll come back and say, well, okay, but what do you personally believe?
Yeah.
And I'll tell them, but I think we buy credibility when we acknowledge that there are different views. Mm-hmm. But we also prepare them for when they enter a new situation and there are different views.
Mm-hmm. I also think that a teenager asking you questions about science, I think we have to try to gain clarity on why are you asking the question that you're asking.
Yeah,
if you're asking questions about science because you're saying that your faith in Jesus depends on this, I'm not sure you're asking the right question. Because our faith is rooted in history. It's not necessarily rooted in science. Is that fair, guys? As it relates to Jesus?
Well, the resurrection is
a historical event, and you cannot scientifically prove history because science has to be repeated and observed.
And the resurrection, the whole point was it blows science out of the water.
Correct.
It's a miracle. That's the point.
That's what makes it a miracle.
But at the bare minimum, it was a historical event, and you can't repeat and observe history. Science has to be repeated and observed for it to be, for there to be proof. No. Yeah. So, and I've said this on several podcasts. I think part of our tension is that for the longest time we've started at Genesis and Revelation and tried to work our way in. I'm not so sure we need to help students start at Jesus and work their way out.
That's good.
Yeah, that's great.
So, but science does speak to the existence of God. And that's where it gets fun.
Yeah.
And there is so much room to play. And those are great questions for kids to have. I just think it's important for them to clarify the answer. To clarify the question.
So Stuart, I want you to dig into, though. You said that you dropped that line, and I didn't want to drive right by it, that a lot of ministries or whatever, you start on the bookends, the Genesis, Revelation, work your way in.
And Revelations in my church growing up.
I think that's...
Yeah, I always said Tim LaHaye would answer those questions.
Sorry, CJ, go ahead.
And I think that's part of the quote-unquote problem, is that if we're not careful, that becomes... what goes on in Revelation and Genesis and so on and so forth become the hills we die on as we're talking about these things with our students.
Right.
And so I wanted to dive into, is that true? Is that what a lot of youth leaders are tempted to do, is die on some of those hills before we get to what's most important, what Chef already mentioned, the resurrection and all of that?
Again, and I'm not trying to be a contrarian, I think you have to clarify what hill are you talking about to the teenager. And most of their questions tend to be on hills in Genesis and Revelation.
Because those are the most interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
But if it's, those are all great things for all of us to explore, and we're going to talk about that more. But my contention to that student is, let's deal with Jesus first, if you haven't already, and then we'll go to those hills and start climbing.
It's interesting you say that, because I have so few kids come to me and say, I just can't believe a man came back from the dead.
Right.
They come to me and say, I can't believe in the flood. I can't believe in an 7-day creation. Yeah.
We're praying for sure.
Or that a man was in the belly of a whale.
Right.
But the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, which... is as amazing a miracle as any of them.
Right.
Is rarely the hang up. So that's interesting you say that. I think you're right. As I have been thinking about this and thinking about how I'd answer myself, as a kid, going to seminary, I had a professor that really helped me, and he gave me this principle called thin ice, or he called it. It's a thin ice. He would say that's a thin ice issue or that's a thick ice issue, and I thought it was interesting.
What did he mean by that?
Well, what he meant was, he said...
Ice Age. He watched Ice Age.
He watched Ice Age, yeah.
And that little squirrel with the acorn.
Big fan.
Exactly. What he meant was, hey, when I read Scripture, there are some things that we all agree on at the foundational, and those are thick ice issues. And what he said, and I'll never forget him saying this because he jumped at the same time, these are things I will jump up and down and scream about, for sure.
And trust that they will hold.
And trust that it will hold. And he said, then there are some other issues in Scripture where I have a belief. It's not that you don't have a belief, or it's not that you don't have a stance. He said, but I also understand that other people may have a stance different from mine, and I'm not quite as confident to jump up and down so loud.
Wow.
And so I will approach it just a little bit differently. Now, listen carefully to that, because it's not saying you don't believe a certain thing.
Right.
It's not saying your theology needs to change based on who you're talking to. It's saying your approach needs to change about your theology. And I just think that is a huge, huge deal here. And back to your question, I think, is so good. Like, what's a kid really asking? I think most kids are really asking. I ran out of air. Sorry about that. Most kids are really asking. Most kids are really asking, hey, can I believe this and still have faith in Jesus?
Wow.
And they're saying, hey, can I even dabble in thinking about this while believing in Jesus? And I think Jesus would go, yeah. Right. I mean, I think his answer to Thomas was, pretty clear. Like, doubts and questions are an important part of growing a kid's faith. And when we shut that stuff down, we're not allowing them to grow in their faith, which I think is one reason that, at least this science-y group of kids that you're trying to lead to follow Jesus, I think it's one of the reasons they're walking away is because we haven't let them wrestle. Mm-hmm. We haven't said, wow. We've said, no, you got to have more faith in that, and all these questions. And again, it's not that you don't believe something, or it's not that you've changed your belief in it. It's your approach.
And I love that, because I feel like that's where, as youth leaders, I feel like sometimes we get hung up, because it does feel like, well, if I share multiple versions of this, or like, hey, here's what other people believe, here's what yada yada yada, it feels like you're sacrificing your beliefs, and you're not.
Well, it feels irresponsible a little bit, because you're like, well, what if they go believe? And I think it's an interesting question. What if they continue to follow Jesus and go and believe?
Is their salvation still intact if they change their beliefs on creation?
Wrestle with that.
Can I ask a hard question?
Yes, I hope. I'm not going to answer it, but sure.
Are there thick ice things in your life that, because of the evolution of thought, are a little less thick? And is it an important thing for the youth leaders and small group leaders that are listening to this, to hold issues with kid gloves to some degree? And obviously, we know what some of those thick ice things are that will never change.
Right.
But do you feel like we've made mountains out of molehills, or thick ice out of thin ice?
Oh, yeah.
And that's part of the issue. Like, we're scared to death to admit, I've been a little dogmatic about this one, and I'm not sure anymore.
Yeah.
Well, where I grew up, everything was thick ice, right? Or maybe that wasn't the entire community. Maybe that was just, my family. But everything was thick ice, and maybe you've experienced this. The older I get, the more my faith grows, the more I study, the more I mature, the fewer and fewer and fewer things are thick ice issues for me. The resurrection is thick ice.
Yeah, let's jump up and down right now on that
Let's jump up and down on that.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things that used to be jump up and downable just aren't anymore.
And part of the reason I'm asking that question, Chef, is because I think when we make declarative statements, it makes us look bad. I'll use this as an illustration. You guys around the table know that our oldest daughter, her senior year, tore her ACL.
Yeah.
We made a controversial decision, and we did cadaver surgery versus taking a part of your patella or your hamstring.
Right.
Well, it is a controversial issue in the medical community because it's new thought.
Right.
But all the data proves that this is a really smart idea. And what we discovered is that part of the reason why some of those doctors are against it is how boldly they've spoken about their position.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily they disputed the evidence. They just, for example, they had been published.
Yeah.
Their ideas have been published. And so they could, like, for them to go, that's a good idea, would mean they're disputing their own publications.
Yeah.
Woe to all of us who publish things.
Yes, right. Yeah. To CJ's chagrin, I want to read a quote. And this was written in 1200.
Is this Tommy Aquinas?
It's Tommy Aquinas. I just love this. I think it says and it just says exactly what you're saying, except applies it to faith.
I know Johnny Hopkins.
In matters that are obscure and far beyond our vision, things that we don't understand, even in such a way we find treated in the Holy Scriptures, meaning things we don't understand and are talked about in Scripture, those things we really don't quite know what they mean. Different interpretations are sometimes possible without prejudice to the faith we have received, meaning we can all go to heaven and believe in Jesus and disagree about parts of the Holy Scriptures.
Oh, wow.
That's what he's saying. In such a case, we should not rush in headlong to so firmly take our stand on one side if further progress in the search of truth, science, justly undermines this position, meaning if we find other things out, like we said, see, the world is flat. And it says it right here in Scripture that the world is flat. Well, if we find out the world isn't flat,
right,
we've just undermined our own, right? But then it goes on to say something that I think is huge. We fall with it. That would be to battle not for the teaching of Holy Scripture, but for our own teaching, wishing its teaching to conform to our opinion, whereas we ought to wish our opinion to conform to the teachings of Scripture. So kind of similar to what you're saying.
So good.
When we take these stands, we get ourselves into a corner. And when things change around us, we're like, uh-oh, we treated this thin ice like it was thick ice, and we jumped up and down, and now people are going, well, why are you in the water? So it's just an interesting idea. And that's 1200. That's before Copernicus. That's before any of these issues we're talking about, in these scientific discoveries, hundreds and hundreds of years before Darwin.
So, Chef, I pulled up something that's even older than your
sweet.
quote.
Oh, my word.
Oh, no.
Chef actually took his jacket off for this one.
Yeah.
But it's kind of along those same lines, like but it's from Romans 14, and it talks about how
Look at them.
Oh,
Drop into the Apostle Paul.
Sally Sunday School just entered.
But it talks about how one person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another, whose faith is weak, only eats vegetables. So, and it goes on to talk about how make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. That if your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you're no longer acting in love. Do not, by your eating, destroy someone for whom Christ died. And I think it gets at, like, when it's okay to have your own interpretations and theologies
Right.
and all of that, but
That's an approach verse.
it is.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah, it's an approach first. We have to be okay if we want to navigate science and faith with the students we're leading. We have to be okay with changing our approach.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you have to change your theology.
And you should feel a tension. Like I mean, to me, the older I get, the more I'm like, when I'm uncomfortable, the best ministry's happening.
That's
you know
good.
what I mean?
The messier, the better.
Yeah, and it's just what it is. And again, I've got to be careful all the time to not, I just love how you talked about, it came up and you say, well, there are different views on this, and you explain it, and you lead to the kids saying, well, what do you believe? And I just think that's a great place to be. And it's like, here I am. I believe Jesus died for me. I love Jesus. I follow Jesus. And when it comes to that thing in Scripture, this is what I've kind of committed to. But you're also kind of saying, and if something changes. And now you're more solid than you are if you just put your foot down.
Mm-hmm. And you're
You know what I
also
mean?
able to point at things that may not even really have any. I mean, it's a great thing for us to talk about and discuss, but I'm not sure what in the scope of things is it really that valuable for you to know this.
Well, even to say what Aquinas says here, even to say when someone asks a question like this, and just say, you know what, science changes all the time, so here's what I think might be the answer. But if science changes tomorrow,
right,
I just want to be careful not to attach it so firmly to this thing that I know is true,
right?
Because that thing's always changing.
Albert Einstein said that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind.
Yeah.
Albert Einstein said that.
Yeah, that's something, huh?
And he was pretty smart.
Even with all of this already on the table, and Chef, I'll go back and poke at you. You don't want to so firmly attach something to, your response that in case something happens, that wasn't the thing that sunk you or whatever. Yeah. That sounds like you're questioning the inerrancy or the authority or whatever you want to say of Scripture.
I would be clear, I'm questioning my understanding of the inerrant Scripture.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because, one, I'm reading a translation that might not be inerrant of the inerrant Scripture, right? I mean, because people argue all the time between the translations. They're sitting right in front of us. I can put them on my computer, on my Bible software, and I can look at 6 of them to try to understand what is actually being said. So I just, that's one of the things is I'm talking about my understanding of Scripture, not the Scripture. And so that's a really, really big point. And I know it feels slippery. But I do feel like I'm reading Richard Rohr right now, Falling Upward, which is about first half of life issues.
I was listening to him on the way here.
Holy cow, what an amazing book. But the point he makes is when you're younger, you need these more solid answers. And Crystal, you've said it. The older I get, as I grow in my faith, the thick ice tends to be thicker and the thinner ice tends to be more common. But there are these, I'm more patient. I'm more asking questions than I'm feeling like I have to answer questions. I'm more listening to somebody and going, you know what? You are in that phase of life where you need black and white answers, and that's okay. So, and you need to be passionate about them now. And you're also kind of knowing, and with years, if you mature, you're going to be, you may or may not, but you probably will be less dogmatic about a lot more things than you're dogmatic now. And I look back at my early years, holy cow, is that true? And we're dealing with young kids. We're dealing with adolescents, right? Who may need some solid answers to move forward. And we should encourage them. I think you should come up with your opinion, but just be careful about other kids' faith. I mean, I just want to I think one of the best lessons I have is I have a neighbor, atheist Andy, super sciencey. He comes down to me and he says these words, I heard you have a physics degree and you're a Christian. And he said, I don't understand how that can be. But I have some questions about faith that I'm afraid to ask Christians because I don't want to mess with their faith.
Oh, wow. Oh. So he's super respectful.
Really
He's
of their
super
faith.
respectful of somebody's faith. He doesn't want to, pull the rug out from anybody. And he said, and basically he said, can I come at you? Can I come at you, friend? And I said, and these are some, like when I look back at my life, this will be a defining moment. Like this is one of the top. I was like, bro, this is my job. Like this is what I do for a living. This is what I've committed my life to. If it's not true, I need to know that. So come at me.
Oh, wow.
And he came at me hard, and I would be lying to you to say he didn't challenge me in a lot of ways, and it forced me in a lot of ways. But my faith is stronger because he asked those questions.
In the words of the great theologian Elton John, you're still standing.
We're still standing,
Yeah.
And I feel like I don't know more than I did before he asked me that question. You know what I mean?
But your willingness to answer and engage in the conversation probably changed his perspective.
But I also would say there's many of us that it would not be a good idea. Like, I don't know that 10 years younger chef would have survived that. Does that make sense?
Right.
I mean, so, we've got to prepare kids for the atheist Andes,
Right. Crystal, I know that you're working on a lot of stuff like post-high school. How does this topic and a youth leader listening to this, does any of this affect? We all know students graduate from high school, go to college, and they really start asking those questions.
Yep.
Does any of that? How would this affect that phenomenon? Or
here's where it gets really tricky, because when you look at students' physical and intellectual development compared to their faith development, there's this kind of like timeline that everybody goes through, right? When you're in preschool, God or whatever you believe in is very mythical. It's very story based. Then it becomes very black and white, right, wrong, good, bad, and then somewhere just after puberty, we begin to develop this ability to understand different perspectives, to hold those, to think about gray areas, to ask questions. And for some of the students we serve, somewhere around 10th or 11th grade is when that starts to happen. And as a church, we can either embrace or reject that, but that's where that is. For some, it doesn't happen until they get to college. But either way, when they get to college...
Or they don't feel safe enough to ask questions until they get to college,
Either way, when they get to college, somebody is bringing up really good questions.
Right.
And so I almost feel an onus and a responsibility to hurry their development at the stage when they're in high school and get them to a place, while they're with me, a safe place to ask questions or to hear somebody else ask questions or to push them a little bit to understand there are at least other perspectives and those perspectives aren't stupid.
It makes me wonder if I'm in 11th and 12th grade in the church I grew up in where I'm talking to somebody who knows my mom and dad. That's not necessarily it depends on how we respond. Is this a safe place to ask a question? I go to college, even if I do get to a new church, I'm now in a new church, and my mom and dad are not connected. It becomes a safer place. So what are ways we can become those safe place for those questions?
In a way, it's like any other.
Hurry it. That's a great.
It's like any other topic we want to talk about with students when it comes to sex and dating. We want to talk about it almost before they have to talk, before they start talking about it in the locker room or before they get into that situation or anything else. Like even if they're not,
to talk about
we should. Right. Like we want to, even if going back to way at the beginning of this episode when we talked about, is this something students are wrestling with? Well, some yes, and some honestly no. And that's okay. That doesn't mean we don't bring some of these things up and don't talk about some of these things, because we want to, before they even need it, to talk about processing hard questions about faith, about the Bible.
And can I clarify something we're saying is I don't think we're saying I want to do an apologetic series and I want to make sure that they have all the right answers so they can make all the right arguments to their professors, who, by the way, are probably going to obliterate them because they're teenagers.
Yeah, and they've done this every year.
This is
new
part of their joy.
Group of freshmen every year.
Yeah. And not all professors are like that. I hate how we make caricatures of professors.
Are out there.
There are some who have fun with it.
Yeah.
But we're not saying you need to do an apologetic series and teach them to defend their faith. Although that stuff is important, they have to be able to wrestle with questions when we're not around and they haven't had 10 hours to do the research and find the answer.
In some regard, we are implying it's not as much us helping them know what to think as much as it is helping them learn how to think.
Yeah.
It's critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that actually, Chef, I learned from you
You did?
just a few years ago. You wrote a series. We're all, if you're a new listener, we're all part of an organization called Orange. We create resources for youth ministries. Curriculum is part of that. And Chef wrote a series for our middle school subscribers. It was called The Who and the How.
Yeah.
And it helped middle schoolers who are just such concrete thinkers begin to think about big questions. And the whole series hinged on this idea that science explains how, faith explains who, and it's okay for the two to coexist. And I thought it was brilliant. In fact, I loved it so much that I'm so excited right now because our high school curriculum is working on a very similar series for high school students that embraces even some further questions, some more complex questions for them. Because they have
much more
bigger
gray.
questions.
Do you have a title for that series yet?
I do. It's called Worlds Apart, and it's the idea that we feel like science and faith are worlds apart.
I was hoping you were going to say Ice Age.
We'll take that into we'll take that to our designers.
But I like Worlds Apart.
CJ, let's put that in
Right.
the ideas
Right.
pile.
Yeah.
And
Ladies and gentlemen, that means that they are poo-pooing on the idea.
suggestion box.
Normally they go, interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
Next point.
Next,
So
CJ.
Interesting.
one of the things I can't wait for this series to come out because I think it's going to be so fun and I think it's going to help some students. And one of the things is we took that thin ice, thick ice idea and said, how can we introduce this to high schoolers in a way that they won't say, it's all thin ice, I can do whatever I want, right? And basically what we borrowed an illustration from our friend Reggie Joyner as well, which was a Jenga tower. Every kid knows what a tower of Jenga blocks looks like. And the idea is when it comes to your faith, there are some blocks that are on the bottom. They are foundational. If you pull those out, your faith isn't Christianity anymore. It's something else. The resurrection is on the bottom of the Jenga tower. But there are some other things that are part of your faith. They're still part of the tower, but you can poke at them. You can pull them out a little bit. You might even move them around a little bit, and your tower's probably not going to fall. Things like creation, evolution, living in the belly of a whale, all of those things. Not to say that we're saying those things are untrue, but students are
Questioning
going to
those
feel a
things.
little bit freer to ask some questions about those things and to even push at them a little bit because your faith isn't going to crumble. And I think that's such a big deal because so many kids feel like, I can't ask questions because if I find out an answer that this isn't true, I can't come back to youth group anymore. These can't be my friends anymore. My identity is going to change. And that's a really tall order. And this sort of frees them up to say, hey, the foundation is the foundation, but everything else you can mess with and you're still going to have a tower. You're still going to have a faith.
So the series is called Worlds Apart. Now, so when does that series release?
It's coming out June 1st.
Awesome. So if you want to learn more about how you can get a hold of that, we'll have links to find out more about that kind of stuff in our show notes. But for now, so as we wrap up, so as we're navigating science and faith and the tensions that we feel as leaders, our students are feeling, do you have any final thoughts, Chef?
Well, I mean, for me, I'm thinking about the listener out there who is a guardian, right? And they are just thinking, but you've got to, truth is truth. And I think guardians are important. I think it's if that's your wiring, I love it. I would ask you to listen to this again before you jump to conclusions, before you hear what we're not saying. Because what we're not saying is there's not truth out there. What we are talking about is approach to kids. And, I read, again, Richard Rohr was talking, he talked about a wise teacher. He said and we may have put you past this, but he said people can only grow about 5% past their core beliefs at a time. And a wise teacher moves people slowly. So we may have pushed you too far here. I ran out of air again. May have pushed you too far here again. But would love for you just to step back, listen to it again. And again, this is about approach. This is about approach, bringing people along wisely because we want them to have a strong faith. And if we try to pile too much on or tell them that legitimate questions aren't legitimate, we're not helping do that. So those are my thoughts. Crystal?
I would say that Jesus was so clear that we are to love God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind. And so to ask questions and use your mind to explore faith, that is not anti-Christian, and woe to us if we act like it is.
Yeah.
That's a part of your faith.
So good.
It's great.
Dang, Crystal, that was so good.
Yay.
I was going to, two things. Maybe it's the thing that I would encourage, maybe it's more important for you to know some of the questions than all the answers. And in the age of decentralization of information, don't keep playing tennis when the game is now soccer.
I don't know what that means because I don't understand sports. Can you help me?
Well, tennis is between two people back and forth.
Uh-huh.
Now, soccer, there's 22 people
Oh, I'm with
on
you.
the field. And so,
You're waiting for the pass, and they're
Right.
down the field.
and
It's a duet or the whole marching band. I got it now.
Yeah, there we go.
Exactly. Yeah, sorry.
There we go.
Sorry, my imbecile jock brain
too
kicked
sporty.
in. Yeah, sorry. But
That's
those
the
are my
best quote of the
closing
whole-
thoughts.
I think that's great.
As Crystal just shamed me in front of everyone.
Sorry, I was a band nerd.
That's perfect.
And I'll add to it that, and we've hinted at it throughout this, but I don't know is a completely okay answer as well.
Oh,
and
it's so good.
And a lot of times that'll earn you even more credibility than coming up with an
Yeah.
answer that,
It's funny you're saying that because I've been sitting here the entire conversation thinking there are so many positions that I wish I would have said I just don't know.
Yeah.
And then to take it one step further, if you're listening to this and you're a ministry leader, a lot of times these questions aren't going to be brought up to you. And it's your small group leaders who are going to be on the front lines of these conversations.
Yeah.
And equipping them with, hey, I don't know is an okay answer. Or
Always a good play.
It is a great place to start as you lead them to have these conversations with their students as well.
Oh, and one more thing. Just like students need a safe place to have these conversations and think about it and ask questions and not be shamed for asking questions, I think youth pastors need those places too.
Yeah.
And if I'm being
that's good.
honest, I don't know that every group on the internet is a safe place.
You don't know?
To have these conversations. I'm
You
trying to
do
be
know.
nice.
I do know the answer to that question.
There are some scary ones.
danger.
But I would say the Facebook group that's currently called XP3 Partners, that's where a lot of our subscribers are, but you don't have to be a subscriber to be in that group. They're some of the nicest people in the world, and I love the conversations that happen there because these are the kinds of questions that we wrestle with. And so that might be a great place to have us continue that conversation.
Yeah, totally. So I know this was a big conversation, but and there's more to it, and I'm sure we'll talk about more in future episodes. But for now, we'll wrap up this conversation and say that hey, we're also adding some resources down in the show notes. So if you're ready to dive into this, we'll add some book links, we'll add some other resources there for you to take your next step as you figure out what it looks like to navigate the tension between science and faith with your students. But for now, thanks for joining us for the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast. If you want to learn more about the curriculum and strategy that we're all a part of here at Orange, including finding out more about the Worlds Apart series that Crystal mentioned. There's also a middle school version of that series we'll link to as well. You can visit our website, rethinkingym.org. Until next time, thanks for listening.